I had always considered myself a man of principle, firm, decisive, and unyielding when it came to what I believed was right. My wife, Lisa, and I had been married for 35 years. To outsiders, we were the perfect couple. But over the past few months, I noticed a shift. Subtle at first, a lingering glance at her phone, a sudden interest in late-night yoga classes, and an almost irritating habit of locking her devices. I didn't confront her immediately, and I wasn't raised to act without evidence. Leadership is about strategy, not impulsiveness. If Lisa thought she could play me for a fool, she underestimated the man she married. One evening, after she excused herself to the gym, I went into action. I had installed a tracking app on her phone 2 weeks earlier, suspecting that her sudden zest for fitness wasn't about losing weight for our upcoming anniversary. The tracker pinged her location, not the yoga studio, but a restaurant across town, one we used to frequent together before she decided she had outgrown the place. The irony didn't escape me. I grabbed my coat and drove there. From the parking lot, I could see her sitting at a dimly lit table with a man I didn't recognize. The laughter, the gestures, they spoke volumes. But I wasn't there to make a scene, I was there to collect facts. I discreetly recorded a video on my phone, capturing the betrayal in crisp, undeniable detail. I wasn't angry, anger implies loss of control. I was calm, cold even. That's the difference between a man who leads and one who flounders. She had made her choice, and I would make mine. When I returned home, Lisa was already in bed, pretending to be exhausted from her workout. I didn't bother waking her. Instead, I sat in my office and began planning. The first step would be ensuring she could never crawl back. The second, well, she'd find out soon enough. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Lisa was still asleep, her face relaxed and peaceful, as if she hadn't spent the previous night lying through her teeth. Watching her, I felt nothing but disdain. This woman had taken vows, built a life with me, yet here she was, betraying it all without a second thought. But I wasn't the kind of man to let anger dictate my actions. No, I believed in strategy, in precision. If Lisa thought she could outsmart me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I grabbed a notebook from my office and started writing down everything I already knew. The tracker app had given me her location at the restaurant, and I had footage from the parking lot to back it up. But this wasn't enough. I needed more: names, dates, evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. After breakfast, I made a call to Brian Keller, an old colleague who had since become a private investigator. I need this done discreetly, I told him. I'll send you the details. Start immediately. Understood, Brian replied, his tone professional. This wasn't his first case like this, and I trusted him to deliver. Lisa emerged from the bedroom an hour later, wearing the same familiar smile she had used to deceive me for months. Good morning, she said brightly. Morning, I replied, barely looking up from my coffee. I could feel her eyes on me, trying to gauge my mood, but I gave her nothing. Let her think everything was fine. The truth would hit her soon enough. By the afternoon, Brian sent me his first findings. There were receipts for expensive dinners at places she had no reason to be, hotel stays she never mentioned, and even a gym membership at a facility across town. It was worse than I thought. She wasn't just meeting someone occasionally, she had crafted an entirely separate life. The man in question? An executive at her company. Married. Kids. A picture-perfect family man, playing the same game Lisa was. The audacity of it made my blood run cold. As I went through Brian's reports, I noticed a pattern. Lisa's betrayals weren't impulsive, and they were calculated. She wasn't just careless, she was arrogant, believing I was too blind or too preoccupied to notice. That, more than anything, solidified my resolve. That evening, she mentioned a work dinner scheduled for Friday. I kept my expression neutral. Sounds important, I said, watching her carefully. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "It is. I won't be home late." "Take your time," I replied, my tone calm. As soon as she left the room, I contacted Brian again. "She's meeting him Friday. I'll need surveillance inside and outside the venue." "Consider it done," he replied. When Friday arrived, Lisa dressed with more care than usual, sleek black dress, flawless makeup. She looked stunning, and under different circumstances, I might have admired her. Instead, I felt nothing. She left the house at 7 p.m., and I waited for her car to disappear before heading out myself. I arrived at the restaurant shortly after she did. From my vantage point, I saw her sitting at a candlelit table with the man I had come to loathe without ever meeting him. They laughed, leaned in close. It was a sickening display of intimacy, the kind I thought we still shared. But I wasn't there to brood. I was there to act. I walked into the restaurant, confident and calm. The maître d' greeted me with a polite smile. "I'm here to join my wife," I said, keeping my voice steady. Lisa's back was to me when I approached their table. Her companion saw me first, his face going pale. Lisa turned slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. "Don't stop on my account," I said as I pulled out my phone. I pressed play on the video I had recorded earlier that week, her entering a hotel with this same man. The audio was crystal clear. The footage, undeniable. I placed the phone on the table, letting the evidence speak for itself. Her companion stammered, attempting to explain, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not here for a conversation," I said coldly. "Enjoy your dinner." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to deal with the fallout. My job wasn't done, not yet. But the first move was made, and the game was mine to control. Lisa didn't come home that night until after midnight. She didn't say much, just claimed that dinner had gone longer than expected and that she was too tired to talk. I didn't press her. Let her believe she was in control. But I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. No, this had evolved. It wasn't about proving her betrayal, it was about ensuring that every decision she had made led to her downfall. I spent the next morning going through the evidence Brian had compiled. Every receipt, every photo, it all painted a clear picture of her deception. But there was something else. As I sifted through her messages with her lover, I noticed references to upcoming plans. They weren't just meeting for drinks or dinners, there was something bigger, something they hadn't yet revealed. By midday, I called Brian again. "I need you to dig deeper. I want to know everything about this man, his family, his finances, his weaknesses." No stone unturned. Brian's response was immediate, "Consider it done." I spent the rest of the day locking down my own affairs. The house, our joint accounts, the credit cards, everything had to be secure. Lisa wouldn't get the chance to blindside me. By the time she realized what was happening, I would already be 10 steps ahead. That evening, Lisa came home earlier than usual. Her mood was unusually cheerful, as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek and started talking about her day like we were still the happy couple she wanted the world to see. "You seem happier," I noted, keeping my voice steady. She paused, perhaps sensing the weight behind my words, but quickly recovered. "I've just been thinking about how lucky I am to have you." The audacity of it. By the weekend, Brian had delivered a full report on her lover. His name was Thomas Wright, a regional manager at her company. Married for 15 years, 2 kids, and a reputation for mentoring female employees. The kind of man who built his success on charm and manipulation. But what struck me most was the financial hole he had dug himself into. Gambling debts, a failing side business, and a pending lawsuit from a former colleague. This man wasn't just a liar, he was desperate. I smiled to myself. Desperation makes people careless. Sunday morning, Lisa told me she had errands to run. I watched her leave the house, then made my way to Thomas's home. It was a modest suburban house, the kind you'd expect from a man trying to project stability. His wife and kids were out, as Brian had confirmed. I knocked on the door, and Thomas answered, clearly not expecting me. "John, isn't it?" he stammered, clearly thrown off balance. "You know who I am," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the panic in his eyes. "Look, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. "No, you can't," I said coldly. "You see, I'm not here to talk. I'm here to inform you that this little game you and Lisa have been playing? It's over." His face turned pale, and for a moment, I thought he might faint. But I wasn't done. "I know about your debts, your lawsuit, and that little gambling problem you've been hiding from your wife," I continued. "And believe me, I'm one phone call away from making sure she knows everything." "You wouldn't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I leaned in closer, my voice low and deliberate. "Try me." I left him there, shaken and visibly terrified. By the time I returned home, Lisa was back, acting as if her world wasn't on the brink of collapse. "Did you miss me?" she asked playfully. I smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. "More than you'll ever know." That night, I finalized the first stage of my plan. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. Saturday morning started the same as any other. The coffee machine hummed, birds chirped outside the window, and Lisa wandered into the kitchen wearing her usual pleasant mask. She moved with an air of practiced ease, humming some cheerful tune as if we were still the happy couple she pretended we were. "Smells good," she said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Did you sleep well?" I didn't look up. "As well as could be expected." She hesitated for a split second before continuing. "I thought maybe we could go out tonight, have dinner somewhere nice. It's been a while." Her audacity was almost amusing. I studied her for a moment, noting the slight tension in her posture. She was testing the waters, trying to gauge how much I knew. But I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of an answer. "We'll see," I said, turning back to my notebook. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, at least for her. While Lisa busied herself with errands, I was busy locking down every financial avenue she thought she had access to. The joint accounts? Frozen. The credit cards? Cancelled. Even her car loan was now under review. I wasn't just cutting her off, I was ensuring she had nowhere to go when the house of cards came crashing down. That evening, she came home with a smile, carrying takeout from a restaurant I hadn't heard of before. She acted as though everything was normal, chatting about the day's mundane details. I played along, nodding where appropriate, waiting for the right moment. After dinner, I leaned back in my chair, my tone casual. "So, how's Thomas doing these days?" The color drained from her face so fast it was almost comical. "Who?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. I smiled faintly. "Thomas Wright. You know, the guy you've been spending all your time with. I hear he's having a rough week. Something about his wife finding out he's a cheating coward?" Lisa's mouth opened, but no words came out. For once, she didn't have a rehearsed excuse. "Don't bother," I said, standing up. "I know everything, Lisa. The lies, the dinners, the hotels. You didn't just betray me, you insulted my intelligence." "I can explain," she finally stammered. "Save it," I snapped, cutting her off. "You're leaving tomorrow. Take what you came into this marriage with, nothing more." She spent the night pleading, alternating between tearful apologies and desperate attempts to shift the blame. She was lonely. I was too focused on work. It was a mistake. I let her talk, offering no reaction, no response. The truth was, I didn't care why she did it. Her reasons, her excuses, They were meaningless to me now. When morning came, I handed her a suitcase and divorce papers. "Sign these," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "They are non-negotiable." She stared at the papers, her hands trembling. "You serious?" "Deadly serious," I replied. Lisa hesitated for a moment, then signed her name, her tears smudging the ink. Sunday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm. The house was quieter without Lisa. For years, her presence had been a constant, whether I wanted it or not. Now, it felt like I could finally breathe, though the air carried the heavy weight of unfinished business. She had taken the suitcase and left, throwing one last glance over her shoulder as if expecting some sign of hesitation from me. There was none. By mid-morning, I found myself at my desk, staring at the file I'd compiled on Thomas Wright. The man I had only known through photos and reports was about to experience the consequences of his choices. He had assumed he could take something that wasn't his without paying the price. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I started with his career. Corporate America is ruthless, but it's also predictable. A well-timed email, packed with damning evidence, would do the trick. I drafted the message carefully, disguising it as a concern from a concerned colleague. The email included everything: photos of him with Lisa, records of hotel stays charged to his corporate card, even rumors about his gambling debts. It wasn't my style to embellish, but the truth was damning enough. "Dear HR," the email began, "I believe it's important for the company to be aware of some potentially damaging behavior from one of its senior managers." I hit send. The rest of the day unfolded exactly as I expected. Brian, ever the reliable investigator, updated me by mid-afternoon. "They called him into a meeting," he said, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. It didn't look pleasant. He left the office carrying a box. Probably his last day there. I couldn't help but smirk. It wasn't just about the job, though losing that cushy title would sting. No, this was about stripping away the illusion of control he thought he had. His colleagues would talk, and that talk would spread. By the end of the week, his reputation would be in shambles. That evening, Brian called again with another update. "Thomas's wife isn't wasting any time," he said. "She filed for divorce this morning. Looks like she's not giving him a second chance." Hearing that was the cherry on top. Thomas had built his life on lies and deceit, and now it was all crumbling around him. Lisa, meanwhile, was learning what it meant to live without the safety net I had provided. Her new apartment, a far cry from the home she had betrayed me in, was already causing her trouble. The landlord had called me earlier, asking for references. I didn't give any. Let her face the consequences of her actions on her own. The next part of my plan was more personal. I wanted Thomas to understand exactly what he had done, not just to me, but to everyone who had trusted him. I arranged a meeting at a quiet park just outside the city. It was a place we both knew, though we had never crossed paths there before. He arrived 10 minutes late, looking haggard and desperate. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice laced with exhaustion. "I want you to listen," I said simply. "You thought you could have it all. My wife, your job, your family. How's that working out for you?" He didn't answer, but his eyes darted around nervously. "Let me make one thing clear," I continued, my tone cold. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed your wife, your kids, your colleagues. You're not a victim, Thomas. You're a coward." He tried to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't a negotiation," I said sharply. "You done. Your life as you knew it is over, and you have no one to blame but yourself." I turned and walked away, leaving him to sit in the silence of his own regret. When I returned home, the emptiness of the house hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had built a life around Lisa, and now, that life was gone. But as I sat in the quiet, I realized something important: I hadn't lost myself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to walk. And that was all that mattered. The day after my confrontation with Thomas, I woke up feeling lighter. Not happier, exactly, but as if the weight of his existence had finally been lifted off my shoulders. He was broken, his life unraveling in ways he couldn't stop. But I wasn't finished yet. Lisa thought she had escaped the worst of it, but she underestimated me. She believed that leaving with her suitcase marked the end of her punishment. She was wrong. By noon, I was in my lawyer's office again, fine-tuning the final stages of my plan. Rebecca, sharp and precise as ever, laid out the legal options. "She's already signed the divorce papers," she said, flipping through the file. "Financially, she's cornered. What else do you want to achieve?" I leaned back in my chair, my tone cold. "It's not just about finances. I want her to feel the same isolation she made me feel. No support. No sympathy. Nothing." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Then we make sure her reputation matches her actions." That evening, I made the first move. Lisa had always been active on social media, cultivating an image of a perfect life and marriage. She used it to show off vacations, anniversaries, and every superficial highlight she could conjure. I drafted a post. It wasn't angry, nor was it emotional. It was factual, straightforward, and damning. After 35 years of marriage, I've learned the truth about my wife's betrayal. While I worked to build our life together, she chose deceit and infidelity. The divorce is final, and I've taken steps to ensure she faces the consequences of her actions. I attached photos, ones I had collected of her with Thomas at restaurants, hotels, and even the yoga studio she had claimed to visit. Nothing graphic, but clear enough to leave no doubt. Within minutes, the post began gaining traction. Friends, family, and acquaintances reacted, some commenting with shock, others offering support. Lisa's carefully curated image was crumbling before her eyes. By the next morning, the fallout had spread further than I anticipated. Lisa's family, who had always seen her as the responsible, loyal one, was calling her non-stop, demanding answers. Friends who had once admired her were suddenly distant, their trust shattered. But the final blow came that afternoon. I received a call from Lisa's employer, who had apparently seen the post. "John, I hate to ask, but, is this true?" the HR representative said hesitantly. I didn't hold back. "Every word of it," I replied. The following day, Lisa was called into a meeting with her manager. She had always been proud of her position at work, but her reputation was everything in her field. The rumors, fueled by my post, had reached her colleagues, and the evidence I had shared painted a clear picture of her character. By the end of the week, she was out of a job. But I wasn't done. That Saturday, I arranged one final gathering, a party at the house. Friends and family were invited, many of whom hadn't seen me since the divorce was finalized. The house was buzzing with conversation when I stepped into the center of the room, raising a glass to get everyone's attention. "First, I want to thank everyone for being here," I began, my voice steady. "This past year has been eye-opening, to say the least. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that honesty and loyalty matter more than anything." The room fell silent. For those of you who might not know, Lisa and I are no longer married. The reasons are no secret, her infidelity speaks for itself. But tonight isn't about her. It's about moving forward. There were murmurs, some looks of surprise, others of approval. I continued, letting the weight of my words sink in. Loyalty, trust, and respect, these are things we should demand from the people in our lives. And when those things are broken, we have every right to take a stand. That's what I've done, and I won't apologize for it. The applause that followed was unexpected, but it felt like a fitting conclusion to everything I had endured. As the evening wound down, a few close friends pulled me aside, expressing admiration for how I had handled the situation. "You didn't just let it slide," one of them said. You made sure she paid for what she did. I nodded, though their words didn't entirely capture how I felt. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about taking control of my life and ensuring that no one ever took me for granted again. When the last guest left, I stood alone in the quiet of the house, reflecting on everything. Lisa and Thomas were shadows of the people they had once pretended to be. Their lives were in ruins, and mine was just beginning. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The house felt different the next morning. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, when the air is heavy with the aftermath. Lisa was gone, but the echoes of her betrayal still lingered in the empty spaces she used to fill. I wasn't one to dwell, though. I had more work to do. Thomas might have thought the worst was behind him, that losing his job and his family was the end of the line. But he was wrong. Men like him don't get to walk away unscathed. He needed to feel the same helplessness, the same destruction, that he and Lisa had brought into my life. I spent the morning in my office, sifting through the documents Brian had sent over. His work was flawless as always, bank statements, loan agreements, and a few carefully obtained phone conversations. Thomas wasn't just in debt, he was in trouble with people who wouldn't hesitate to ruin him entirely if they knew the full story. The plan was straightforward. I drafted an email, carefully worded to sound like one of his creditors. "We're done waiting," it read. "If you don't resolve this immediately, your wife and kids won't just know, they'll see the evidence." It was a lie, of course. Thomas's wife already knew everything, and she'd kicked him out days ago. But he didn't need to know that I was bluffing. Men like Thomas are ruled by fear, and fear was the tool I intended to use. By early afternoon, he called. His voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Who is this?" he demanded, though it was more of a plea than a question. "You're past catching up with you," I replied coldly. "Meet me tonight. I'll send the address. Don't be late." I hung up before he could respond, letting him stew in his own anxiety. The location was a dilapidated parking lot near an old industrial site, a place where shadows fell heavy and no one would hear us. I chose it deliberately, knowing the atmosphere alone would put Thomas on edge. He arrived just as the last light of the day faded, his car rolling to a hesitant stop. He stepped out slowly, his eyes darting nervously in every direction. "John," he called out, his voice shaky. I stepped out from the shadows, my expression calm but unyielding. "Thomas," I said evenly. "You didn't expect me, did you? What's going on?" "What do you want?" he stammered, his face pale under the harsh glow of the streetlights. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my coat and pulled out a thick envelope. I tossed it at his feet. "Take a look," I said. He bent down, fumbling with the envelope. Inside were copies of the documents Brian had gathered, proof of his debts, his failed business dealings, and every sordid detail of his personal life. "You're done," I said coldly. "Your reputation, your career, your family, everything you've built is crumbling because of your arrogance. And now you'll live with the consequences." Thomas dropped the papers, his hands trembling. This isn't necessary," he stammered. "I can fix this. I'll pay it back." "You think this is about money?" I interrupted, my voice sharp. "This is about the choices you made, the lives you destroyed. My life, your wife's life, your children's lives. You thought you could take and take without ever paying the price. Now, the bill has come due." He tried to plead, his words tumbling over each other in desperation, but I wasn't interested. "Get out of my sight," I said, my voice low but firm. "And don't ever cross my path again." I stood there, watching as he stumbled back to his car, his shoulders slumped and his spirit broken. He was a shadow of the man he had pretended to be, and that was enough. The drive home was silent, the kind of silence that feels earned. When I stepped into the house, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, staring out into the night. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as though I had finally rid myself of the weight I'd been carrying. Lisa was gone. Thomas was ruined. And me? I was still standing. For the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself a moment of peace. Not triumph, not joy, just peace. I didn't wake up to a house full of noise anymore, no clattering plates, no hurried footsteps. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that forces you to listen to your own thoughts. I poured my coffee, letting its warmth steady me as I stared out the window. Lisa's absence wasn't just physical, it was like the house had exhaled for the first time in years. The air felt lighter, but the weight of what had been done still lingered. Today wasn't about peace, though. It was about finishing what I started. By mid-morning, Brian called, his voice carrying the same confident edge I'd come to expect from him. "You going to love this one," he said. Turns out Thomas's little escapades didn't just stop at insider trading. He's got a full-blown embezzlement case waiting to blow up in his face. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a low whistle. "How bad is it?" "It's bad enough," Brian replied. "The guy's been skimming funds for years. We're talking 6 figures, minimum." That was all I needed to hear. "Send it over," I said. Minutes later, my inbox pinged with an email. Attached were detailed spreadsheets, correspondence, and even a few damning audio files. If Thomas thought he was at rock bottom, he was about to find out just how deep the pit could go. The email I drafted wasn't just anonymous, it was surgical. Addressed to his former company's compliance team in the SEC, it laid out the evidence with brutal clarity. Attached are documents detailing fraudulent activities committed by Thomas Wright. These include embezzlement, falsified reports, and breaches of corporate ethics. I reviewed it twice before hitting send. There was no satisfaction in the act itself, it was simply another step in the process. But knowing what was about to come? That was enough. Lisa, meanwhile, was in her own free fall. Brian's reports painted a bleak picture, her eviction notice had been served, and her financial situation was unraveling fast. She had tried to lean on friends, but most had distanced themselves after the truth about her betrayal came out. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Lisa had spent years crafting a perfect image, only for it to shatter under the weight of her own choices. I made one last call to her landlord, posing as a concerned neighbor. "She's been known to mismanage her finances," I said. "You might want to be cautious." The landlord thanked me, frustration evident in his tone. Lisa's fate was sealed, but it wasn't my job to fix it. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was another voicemail from Thomas. His voice, usually so full of smug confidence, was now thin and desperate. "John, I don't know what you've done, but it has to stop. Please, I'm begging you. Just stop." I deleted it without listening further. Thomas had spent years building a life on lies and deceit, and now it was crumbling. He had no one to blame but himself. The next night, I hosted a small gathering at the house, a few close friends and family, the people who had seen me through the storm. The living room buzzed with quiet conversation, laughter, and the warmth of people who truly mattered. As the evening wore on, I stood to make a toast. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to me. "First, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight," I began. "This year has been transformative, to say the least. It's reminded me of what's truly important: loyalty, honesty, and the people who stand by you when things fall apart." I paused, letting the words settle. For those who may not know, Lisa and I are no longer married. Her decisions made that inevitable. But tonight isn't about her, it's about moving forward. It's about rebuilding something better, something stronger. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was genuine. I could see it in their eyes, the understanding, the quiet support that had carried me through the darkest days. When the last guest left, the house was quiet again. I sat by the window, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the city lights. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was peaceful, a blank slate waiting to be filled. Lisa and Thomas were gone, their lives in tatters. And me? I was still standing. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, one I would write on my own terms. The morning felt different. The kind of different that comes when you know the storm is finally clearing. The sunlight poured through the blinds, warm and golden, yet the air carried a chill that reminded me the past wasn't entirely behind me. Not yet. I stood at the kitchen counter, sipping my coffee, the faint aroma filling the room. Today wasn't just another step in the process, it was the step. The final chapter wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about ensuring the story ended with justice, no loose ends, no questions left unanswered. By mid-morning, Brian called. His updates had become part of my routine, but today, his tone was sharper, almost triumphant. "You're not going to believe this," he started, a hint of amusement in his voice. "What now?" I asked, setting my mug down. Thomas just had a very bad morning. The SEC issued a formal subpoena for his financial records, and his creditors are circling him like vultures. They're pulling the strings faster than even I expected. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. "What about his company?" "They're done with him," Brian replied. "They've already started cooperating with the authorities. Word is, his old colleagues are throwing him under the bus to save themselves." The mental image of Thomas, once smug and untouchable, now scrambling to salvage what little was left of his reputation, brought a sense of closure. "Good," I said simply. That afternoon, I took things a step further. I reached out to Rebecca, the journalist who had already published the damning exposé on Thomas. Her article was gaining traction, with media outlets picking it up nationwide. "Rebecca," I said when she answered, "I've got more for you." "What is it?" she asked, her voice eager. I explained the SEC investigation, the creditor lawsuits, and how Thomas's entire network was collapsing under the weight of his fraud. "This is more than a story now," I said. "This is a public reckoning." She didn't hesitate. "Send it all over. I'll make sure it lands where it needs to." By the end of the day, another article was live. This one didn't just expose Thomas, it dismantled him. Every skeleton in his closet was laid bare for the world to see. Meanwhile, Lisa was hitting rock bottom in her own way. Brian had sent over an update earlier that morning, as she was officially being evicted, and her attempts to secure a new apartment were failing spectacularly. No one was willing to take a chance on someone with her reputation. Her social life was in shambles, too. Friends who once adored her had turned their backs, unwilling to be associated with her mess. Even her own family was keeping their distance, their disappointment palpable in every unanswered call. It was almost poetic. She'd spent years crafting an image of perfection, only to have it dismantled by her own actions. That evening, I received a text from Brian. "Thomas just tried to call you again," it read. "Figured you'd want to know." I didn't bother listening to whatever desperate plea he'd left this time. There was nothing he could say to change what was coming. Instead, I turned my attention to Lisa. It was time for one final confrontation, a conversation that would leave no room for misinterpretation. The diner was quiet when I arrived, its neon sign casting a soft glow on the pavement outside. I chose a booth in the corner, away from the other patrons, and waited. Lisa walked in a few minutes later, her shoulders hunched, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She looked like a shadow of the woman she used to be. She slid into the booth across from me without a word, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it on the table between us. "This," I said, my tone calm but firm. "This is everything you've done. Every lie, every betrayal, every choice that led us here. She stared at the folder but didn't reach for it. I'm not here to argue or rehash the past, I continued. I'm here to tell you that this is the last time we'll speak. From this moment on, you're nothing to me. Her eyes widened, the tears pooling but not falling. John, she started, but I raised a hand to stop her. No, I said sharply. You don't get to explain. You don't get to apologize. You made your choices, Lisa. Now you'll live with them. I stood, leaving the folder untouched on the table, and walked out without looking back. When I got home, the house was silent again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like mine. I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. For the first time in years, the weight was gone. Lisa and Thomas were out of my life, their worlds collapsing under the weight of their own actions. And me? I was finally free. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that didn't demand to be filled. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't wake up thinking about Lisa or Thomas. The weight they'd brought into my life had finally lifted, but I knew this wasn't the end, not yet. The final steps were in motion, and while I wasn't looking for revenge anymore, I was determined to see it through. Brian called around noon, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction that told me he had news. "You going to want to hear this," he began. "What is it this time?" I asked, already suspecting it had to do with Thomas. "He's officially under investigation," Brian said. "The SEC is digging through every account, every transaction. They've frozen his assets, and his creditors aren't waiting around, they're seizing everything they can get their hands on." "Good," I replied, my tone colder than I expected. Brian continued. "It gets better. His wife filed for divorce yesterday. She's taking the kids and whatever's left." The image of Thomas, broken, abandoned, and cornered, flashed through my mind. He'd spent years pretending to be untouchable, but now his empire was crumbling. That afternoon, I got a text from Rebecca. "The follow-up is live," she wrote, attaching a link. I opened the article, and the headline was brutal: "Thomas Wright, the fraud behind the fortune." Rebecca had gone deeper this time, uncovering more about Thomas's past, the shady business deals, the fraudulent practices, even his manipulative behavior with colleagues. It wasn't just a story, it was a takedown. The comments section was a feeding frenzy. Former colleagues chimed in with their stories, painting an even darker picture of Thomas than I had imagined. Strangers weighed in, tearing him apart, and a few even speculated on how much prison time he might face. By the time I finished reading, it was clear that there was no way back for him. Lisa wasn't faring much better. Brian had sent over an update earlier that day. She'd been evicted from her apartment, her belongings packed into her car, and she had nowhere to go. Her calls to friends and family were going unanswered. For years, she'd built a life on lies and appearances. Now, she had nothing left. That evening, as I poured myself a drink, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call, not a text. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me to pick up. "John," the voice on the other end was strained, barely above a whisper. It was Thomas. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone flat. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I've lost everything, my job, my family, my home. Just stop. I'll do whatever you want. Just tell me what to do." I let the silence stretch out, savoring the moment. Finally, I replied, my voice cold and deliberate. "What I want," I said slowly, "is for you to understand that this is what you deserve. Every choice you made led you here. And now, you'll live with it." But I didn't let him finish. "Goodbye, Thomas." I hung up, his pleading still ringing in my ears. The next day, I took a long walk through the park. The air was crisp, the sun warm on my face. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. The chains that had bound me to the past were gone. When I got back home, there was a package waiting on the porch. Inside was a handwritten note from Rebecca. It read, "Justice is a rare thing these days. But this? This is justice." Attached was a clipping of her latest article. I didn't need to read it to know what it said, I already knew the truth. That evening, I hosted a small gathering at the house. Just a few close friends, the people who had stood by me when things were at their worst. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and quiet conversations. As the night wound down, I stood to make a toast. The room fell silent as everyone turned to face me. "This year has been a journey," I began. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life has a way of showing you who truly matters. Loyalty, honesty, and the people who stand by you when the world feels like it's falling apart, those are the things that count." I paused, letting the words sink in. For those who don't know, Lisa and I are no longer married. Her choices made that inevitable. But tonight isn't about her, it's about moving forward. It's about building something better, something real. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was genuine. These were the people who mattered, and their support meant everything. When the last guest left, I sat alone in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the background. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was peaceful. Lisa and Thomas were gone, their lies and betrayals buried beneath the weight of their own choices. And me? I was finally free.